Well, welcome. Thanks for joining me. My name is Gary, and I am obviously a ranger. I have been at Biscayne National Park now for, since, let's see, 1989. What does that make? 33 years. And joined the National Park Service in 1986, so I've been around even longer with that. And, I was 7 years old when my parents took me on a trip across the U.S. I was born and reared here in South Florida, and my dad retired a little bit early because my brothers were much older and could take over the family business. And we went on this big loop in our 15-foot long travel trailer, 3 of us, in a sky blue Ford pickup, and we went for 6 weeks.
Wow.
Out around here. And I know how incredibly fortunate I am to have done that, because it was on that trip that I decided what I was going to do with the rest of my life, and that was to become a National Park Ranger. And so I have absolutely fallen in love with these amazing places. And I've got a map up here. Many people, not pointing at anyone in particular, but many people think there are only 63 national parks. But we in the National Park Service, we don't believe that at all. We consider all 423 places, whether they are called national parks, national monuments, national seashores, national battlefields, whatever it might be, we consider them all national parks. And so you each have one of these except for you, but I got you.
Okay.
And these folks need one too, so I'll come on back. Before you even sit down, take one of those, and one for you. I want you to put that magnetic I found my park thingy up on the map here at the national park that is closest to where you live. Make no assumptions. Find where you live and then find the national park that is closest, because
423 on them, or just the big 60?
this actually is missing like 8 because it's an older map.
Oh, so this is like the centennial map or something?
Yeah.
Oh, Pipestone is a national.
Oh, look, we've got learning going on. Danger,
Mississippi,
danger.
oh, the Mississippi area is probably my closest.
Tom's gonna bump
Your
mine off.
favorite park or mine?
Don't let him bump mine off.
Anything in green on there that's labeled is a national park in our context today.
Grant
So.
Course.
Sorry.
Grant Course.
Oh,
That's
I
my
think it was
closest.
50-50.
Grant Course?
Grant Course.
Oh.
Grant.
Where did you put? West
And if by chance, I should have mentioned this sooner, if by chance someone is not from the U.S. and doesn't live in the U.S., pick another national park that you really love and pop it in there.
Grant Course.
Where's Walden?
It's a band.
Oh,
We're on a
okay.
long road trip visiting all the national parks, and we met a band along the way.
Groupies in a weird way, huh?
Right?
Walden's right on the other side of Rocky Mountain National Park.
Yeah.
Well, there's also Walden Pond, which is very close to Minuteman. All right. Oh, look, we got quite the spread here today. Excellent. So we have somebody from the Boston area. Oh, that's you. So what national park is actually closest to where you?
Where I grew up?
Yeah.
Salem Maritime.
Salem Maritime National Historical Park, the first national historical park, and amazing collection of buildings related to the early maritime history of the U.S. And there's a companion park on the west coast in San Francisco Maritime, which has an amazing collection of historic ships. If you ever get out there, it's really an extraordinary place. All right, and then we have down here by the D.C. Richmond area.
Yes.
What national park?
Well, it's kind of away from that area. It's closer to Charlottesville, Shenandoah National Park.
Okay, but are you in Richmond?
No, Charlottesville.
Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
so
it's about an hour from Richmond.
yeah. So
It's
you have a World Heritage site there with Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. But Maggie Walker, have you been to Maggie Walker?
No, I haven't.
Maggie Walker is an amazing site that I have not been to, but happens to be one of Sandra's very favorite parks.
Yes.
And Maggie Walker was the first black woman, or first woman, period, right? First woman to be a bank president in the United States, and she also happened to be African American. So pretty amazing story there. And we have some folks from the Chicago, Northern Ohio area. And what national park's closest to your home there?
Cuyahoga Valley.
Cuyahoga, Perry's Victory, out on the lake there. Yep.
Nice.
And we've got some Iowans. Awesome. Have you been to both national parks in Iowa?
Been to the West Branch.
Okay.
We have not, Effigy Mounds, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have not been there.
Okay. Herbert Hoover, you know, when he needed to get away from Iowa, you know where he came? Florida Keys. Yeah, we have pictures of him and Lou fishing out here in the Florida Keys, and he actually hung out at Adams Key, which is one of our islands here in the park. So, and of the 4 presidents who spent time in Biscayne National Park, the man who took them all out as their fishing guide said that Hoover was the best of the lot. So,
He had a fishing camp in Shenandoah.
and he had a fishing camp in Shenandoah too, called R starts with
Rapidan.
Rapidan. All right, we have some Minnesotans. Mississippi National River and Recreation Area.
The closest.
Yep. And then we have some northern Minnesota Voyageurs people.
No, we blew it. Pipestone's closer.
Pipestone. And what's Pipestone about? You know?
Well, it's got a style rock. It's a prairie area. It's got a special kind of rock that was used by natives to make pipestone.
Yeah. It was. If you ever look at a peace pipe, that reddish stone is called catlinite. It's a very special stone that was in this one area, and everybody gave up their arguments and their fussing and their fighting to come and get that stone there, and those people still collect that stone from that area for those purposes there. We have some Coloradans. We have a Rocky Mountain person and a Curricanti person. Is that?
Black Canyon.
Black Canyon. Okay, Black Canyon and Curricanti are right next door to each other practically. One is a national recreation area and one is a national park. But yeah, see? Now you're gonna go check it out, right?
Is it by the sand dunes?
It's right next door. It's actually where we go over
Just
here.
south.
It's just a little bit south and a little bit east.
Oh.
So
Gunnison?
No, the same.
it's in Gunnison. The headquarters is Gunnison, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
South.
and then we have up here we have Grant Coors Ranch. That's Sandra from Missoula. And we have 2 more people that joined us. I will go ahead and pop yours on there. What national park is closest to your home?
Cuyahoga Valley now.
Cuyahoga. So you're from northern Ohio?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we'll pop that up there as well. So already I think some of you are seeing that the idea of a national park is a little bit broader than most everyone recognizes. It's all not all the Grand Canyons and the Yellowstones and things like that. But my fascination with national parks, as I mentioned to you, began when I was 7. And I have traveled to now 264 out of the 423. And I have had some personally amazing experiences in there. When I was a kid with my parents, we went to Yellowstone. And I got to visit there and see an amazing diversity of wildlife. We got to see bears, and we got to see bison, and we got to see elk and all kinds of things. But there was one animal that we did not get to see when I was there as a 7-year-old. The wolf. The wolf.
Sasquatch.
Because, well, Sasquatch, giraffes, hippopotamus, I didn't see any of those, right? But they're not supposed to be there. But, so, yeah, we didn't get to see wolves, because wolves had been extirpated, wiped out from that area, because way too many people believed the stories about girls in Little Red Riding Hoods and wolves or pigs getting their houses blown down, and everybody hated wolves. So they killed off all the wolves. But in my lifetime, wolves had been reintroduced into that area. So a few years ago, I decided I wanted to go back to Yellowstone to look for wolves. I decided that would make a great birthday present to myself. I was born in February. What's Yellowstone like in February? It was crazy cold, especially for a South Floridian, but we went. And we went to the north end of the park. And you know, the north end is the only part of the park that you can actually drive through on your own during the winter months. There's one road that's open along there. And almost immediately upon leaving our lodgings there, we pulled out and I saw this 4-legged, pointy-eared, pointed-nosed coyote. And fooled me for a second, but it was cool. And we continued along and we saw, and I don't remember the order that we saw them in, but we saw otters and we saw We saw water ouzels, this crazy little bird that was hopping around on the rock on top of the half-frozen river and completely submerged itself under the river, swam under the water, freezing water, comes up with a little buggy thing in its mouth, and super cool, never even knew they were there. And we saw the elk, and we saw the bison in the road, and we saw this kind of stuff, but no wolves. So we drive all the way back up and around and down to West Yellowstone. And from West Yellowstone, there are 3 ways to get into the park. You can go in on foot, snowshoes or cross-country skis. I'm from South Florida. I enjoy cross-country skiing, but that was too cold for me. You can go in on snowmobiles. That sounds noisy and unpleasant to me as well. So we paid instead an exorbitant sum of money to a person who took us in on a snow coach, which is this heated cabin, heated being the key word, heated cabin on these big treads that roll along, right? And we go on a wildlife tour, and we go all over, and man, did we see wildlife that day. We saw the bison, we saw the elk, we saw the otter, we saw the beaver, we saw foxes. Have you ever seen on a television show where the foxes are hunting in the snow, and they walk along and they go, and they're listening with those giant ears in the snow, and they're listening for mice and things moving under the snow, and then they stop, and they go, wah, boom, and they jump with their face straight down into the snow and pop up with a mouse in their mouth. I saw that. It was crazy cool. And we just saw so much, but no wolves. So the driver looks at his watch and says, well, it's 3:30. And you know what 3:30 means at Yellowstone in the wintertime? It's getting dark. Yeah, it's getting dark. And so we have to turn around. And I'm way disappointed because I didn't get to see my wolf. We're driving along, and all of a sudden he slams on the brakes. He points out the window and he says, wolf. And he's pointing at this tree line that's 200, 300 yards away. And I said, you see a wolf over there? And he says, no, I don't see a wolf over there. They see a wolf over there. And he pointed to those bison that were between us and them. And all those bison were all looking in the same direction. He pulled out a spotting scope, and unless he painted a little black wolf on the end of that lens when I wasn't watching, sure enough, there was a lone black wolf lying up against that tree line. So I got to see my wolf. But I gotta be honest with you, I was still kind of disappointed. I guess I should have been more specific. What I really wanted to see was a pack of wolves chasing down an elk, taking it down, blood dripping in the snow. And I didn't get to see that.
Isn't that what National Geographic is?
Yes, but I wanted that National Geographic moment for myself. So I was a little disappointed, but that night I went to a ranger program. If you ever go to national parks, try the ranger programs, they're amazing. And I pull in to the visitor center there, and the talk that night is about wolves. And Ranger Rita Garcia, who's now at Big Cypress National Preserve, she told a story about wolves, how they had been plentiful in the area, how they had been wiped out, the controversy over reintroducing them, how they were doing so well. And I'm sitting there listening to all of that, and I come to a realization that you would think a National Park Ranger should have come to a whole lot quicker than he did. And that realization was, whether I saw a wolf or not was completely irrelevant. What really mattered was that the wolves were there. And that they were not only surviving, they were thriving. So if I were to distill that story down into just 6 words, which is my shtick for the day, it's enough to know they're there. I'll put that one up by Yellowstone. We visited Hawaii, and there are 8 national parks now in Hawaii. Perhaps the most famous one is the one that was made a national park before it even became a state. Back then it was called Volcanoes National Park, and now it's called Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And I met up with a ranger who used to work here at Everglades, Jay Robinson, And we chatted with him in the back office there for a little bit, and I said, Jay, what I really, really want to see on this trip is I really want to see lava flowing. And in my mind, that meant flowing into the water, because that's what you see on National Geographic, right? And he said, well, it's not happening right now, but here, let me do this for you. He reaches into the recycling bin, pulls out an old piece of paper, grabs a stubby pencil and a blue crayon out of his desk, and draws me a map. And says, you go up here, you go up here, and a whole map of how to get there, right? And he says, and before you do, go over here and stop at the hardware store and get some gloves. And I'm like, gloves? What do I need gloves for? He said, because that lava that you're gonna be walking across is razor sharp, and if you fall, your hands are gonna turn into hamburgers out there. So we stop at the hardware store and we pick up gloves that are leather gloves and wool lined, because that's all they had, which are super useful. They're pristine to this day because I still have them, and you don't use wool lined leather gloves much in South Florida. But we picked those up and we followed his map, and just before we walked out the door, he said, oh, one more thing. Don't walk on the silver stuff. And I said, the silver stuff, what does that mean? And he just smiles and he says, you'll see. So we go off and we walk for several miles across what they call the Pali. And the lava is the type, right? The sharp stuff that if you were walking on it barefoot, you go, ah! And so I don't know if that's why they call it that, it's not, but the lava, and there's the pohoi lava, which flows ropey like. And we're walking across all this, and it was thankfully a very cloudy day. So as that black would have soaked up the heat, and it would have been so hot out there. And finally we come to a place that's probably about half the size of this room that we have to climb up. Very thankful for the leather gloves at that point. Climbed up to the top of that, and then all of a sudden, right over here, I see this crack, like this, and it's glowing orange. I'm beside myself, right? It's glowing orange. And I look over here, and there's orange moving. And I took a picture, and I took another picture, and I took another picture. I took like 30 pictures in 10 seconds. I can make a flip book out of it to watch it flow across, right? It was amazing to see this. And I'm realizing that all around us, it's flowing, and there's nobody else there. There's one family far off, and there's one couple over here that we started chatting with, and they were celebrating their honeymoon. And the guy, he was like this big burly guy, and he's like hopping all over. Look at that, look at that. He's just like me, we're children out there, right? And I'm spitting on the lava and putting little sticks in it and watching it catch fire. And honeymoon lady, not so keen on this whole experience at all. She was nervous as all get out, and she's, honey, stop, honey, stop, honey. She's gonna lose her brand new husband, right? It was amazing. And then it started to rain. Very, very soft rain. And you know what happens when a nice soft rain hits brand new hot earth?
Pops.
Pops and sizzles and steams. The whole place goes psh. I thought it was amazing. Honeymoon guy thought it was amazing. Honeymoon lady, not so much. She wasn't putting two and two together, and she screams at the top of her lungs, oh my God, we gotta get out of here, it's gonna blow! Her husband laughed hysterically at her. I'm not sure how long that marriage lasted, but we all had a good laugh of it. But it was an amazing experience to see. And thinking about it later, I realized that one of the things that made it an amazing experience is that I was an eyewitness to creation. How do you see that anywhere else? It was amazing. So national parks are about wildlife, and national parks are about incredible scenery. But national parks are also about this nation's incredibly diverse history as well. Yeah.
What about the silver?
Oh my gosh, I forgot all about the silver. So, when lava is flowing, it's bright orange red. When it cools, it doesn't immediately turn black. That surface crusts over in a very, very thin crust that is silver in color, like shiny nickel silver. And certainly if you stepped on that and walked through it, you would go right through, and that would be super dangerous. So thank you for catching me on that one here. So But national parks are more than the wildlife, they're more than the scenery. More than half of the national parks are actually about protecting this nation's stories and history. And in eastern Pennsylvania, there is a national park that protects an amazing story of the first 3 days in July in the year 1863, when people gathered near a little town called Gettysburg. And when I was a little boy and visited Gettysburg with my folks, I became completely enamored with this story. I got back and all my reports and essays that year in classes were all about Gettysburg. I could tell you who was on Seminary Ridge and who was on Cemetery Ridge and which general moved where and what happened at Devil's Den and what happened here and there. And I knew all that stuff like crazy. And I have long since forgotten all of that. But what I do remember is that the ranger there told me a story. He said after the battle, they had a lot to clean up. There were tens of thousands of casualties, and they had to gather up the bodies and bury those bodies. They had to gather up the body parts and bury those. They had to gather up 5,000 to 7,000 dead horses and mules that had died out there and take care of those. They had to gather up all of the government property, the cannons, the carriages, the saddles, the swords, the buckles, all that kind of stuff as much as they could, and the many, many guns that were lying out there. And the story I remember him telling me was that some of those guns were still loaded. They were in the museum and still loaded. Not loaded once, some of them twice, 3 times, 5 times, and unless I'm misremembering, I think it was 19 times one of those guns had been loaded and not shot off. Think about that for a minute. How chaotic was it on that battlefield that you couldn't even hear the gun in your own hands go off? You're watching people die around you, the smoke, the smell, the horror of it all, and you didn't even know the gun in your own hand hadn't discharged, and you continued to load and shoot and load and shoot and load and shoot. And I know I am an incredibly fortunate individual that I have never been to war, as some in this room have, but I glimpsed the chaos of war. And I know that it's something I do not want to witness, ever. In Alabama, there's a national park in the town of Selma. And I'm sure when I say the name Selma, if you're from the United States, most people know something about what happened there. And I did too. But when I went to that park and I walked into the visitor center on a beautiful spring day and heard the story of what happened there from a ranger dressed just like me, when I heard about how the people of Selma were denied the right to vote like so many other people throughout the South were because of the color of their skin, how they would go in to register to vote and had to answer questions on a questionnaire about this nation's history and our ideals and things like that, and how if you were black, sometimes you got some extra questions at the end. Questions like, how many seeds are there in a watermelon? How many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? And when you couldn't answer questions like that, well, clearly you were not smart enough to vote, and you were denied that right. And people all over America, not so much in the South, but everywhere else, thought that that was pretty awful. And the people in Selma decided to do something about it. They decided to march. And they were going to march all the way to their state capital, some 50 miles away. And so one Sunday morning, they set off. And they had barely left town when they came to the Alabama River, where there was a bridge crossing the river named after a former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. And they climbed up that bridge. It's got kind of a slope to it like this, so you don't really see what's on the other side as you're walking up on this side over here. And when they got to the top, they saw a wall of blue hatred there with police officers ready to beat them down with sticks. And that actually happened Many people were beaten to the ground, had their skulls cracked open on a day that was known as Bloody Sunday. A few days later, a somewhat larger group attempted to make that same march, and at the front of that group was a man named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who led that crowd, got to that same point on the bridge, found the exact same situation, and thought, this is not a good idea. And he asked if they could kneel and pray instead, and they were denied that right. And so Dr. King led his flock back, a day that came to be known as Turnaround Tuesday. 2 weeks later, 10,000 people marched from Selma to Montgomery, taking the whole nation by storm with that idea of equality that we still struggle for greatly in this country. When I heard that story, I felt like I had heard it before, but I guess I hadn't been listening. And so I decided I wanted to walk at least a little bit of that. So we got the map from the ranger and we headed off through the march route through the town. Even though you could see the bridge from the visitor center, we followed through town for a little bit, this depressed little town on a gorgeous spring day. And soon we found ourselves facing down that bridge. And as I stepped onto that bridge, something happened. I felt something coming out of the ground into me. I felt my breath get shallow, my heartbeat quicken. It wasn't because I was out of shape. It was because history was alive in that spot. You know, some of you in this room are probably old enough to remember the old Coca-Cola slogan, "It's the real thing." That's what's special about national parks too, is they are the real thing. Really. Up in New York Harbor, there's a national park. She's been there for a while, holding this thing over here, holding this thing up in the air. And she's been there for a really long time. The Statue of Liberty, and associated with that, Ellis Island, where some of my ancestors and perhaps some of yours came through as well. And I purposely went to Ellis Island in the afternoon because I was trying to avoid the school kids. Don't tell the kids. And so I go in, and it's relatively empty, and it was really special to be in these echoing hallways and hear this story. And I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have a big globe in the lobby there, and it had little lights on it, and the lights kind of showed this pattern of flow about how people came from Europe, and people came from Africa, and people came from all over the place, and all kind of coming to America that way. And it was kind of neat to stand there and watch, and I was the only one looking at the map, with the exception of one woman who I'm gonna guess was probably about 30, 35 years old, and her son, who was probably about 3 or 4 years old. And they stood there looking at the map, and for him at that point, it was just a flashing light show. But that mom said, "Your great Oma came from there, and she came down this way, and over to here, and we live here." And I found that to be such an incredibly special moment, to get that little bit of insight into a little person, for the first time perhaps, getting their own history, learning about that in a national park. And so that is another special memory for me. Your great-grandmother came from there. And here at Biscayne National Park, you hear the noise, the sounds of people out there, similar to yourselves, coming into the visitor center. Wintertime is our time at Biscayne National Park for the visitor center. Not so much out in the park. Summertime is crazy busy out there with people snorkeling and boating and doing all that kind of stuff. But in the visitor center, winter is our time. Summer, not so much. It's often really warm, and lots of people who are here from Minnesota and places like that are staying in Minnesota because it's cooler there. So sometimes I'll sit out at the desk there waiting for visitors to come in. And this one day, it was a hot summer day, and there had been nobody in for about an hour and a half. So when I looked down that ramp that many of you came up, and I saw a couple coming up, I got sort of excited. I jumped up, And I greeted them as they walked in, and my goodness, were they sweet people. They were probably in their 70s and just so incredibly full of life. The smile and the genuineness of everything they asked. She had all kinds of papers in her arms, and she was asking all kinds of questions. I gave the basic orientation to the park about the size and the islands and all that kind of stuff. And she would ask questions that nobody ever asked. You know, everyone asks, where's the bathroom? What can we do here? She's like, where's Porgy Key? Like, nobody ever asked about Porgy Key, so I pointed out over here. And she says, and where's Stiltsville? And we talk about Stiltsville for a while. And every time she asks one of these kind of odd questions, she reaches down and looks down at these papers that she's got in her arms like this. Curiosity is killing me. What is she looking at? And I look down and I see it's like an old yellowed newspaper. And it's got all kinds of underlines and little notes in the margin and some highlights. And she's referring to this over and over. And finally I said, so what do you got there? And she said, oh, this is an article that my son wrote about Biscayne National Park. He wrote for the Miami New Times, which is our alternative weekly newspaper here in Miami. And she said, this is a story that he wrote 1 year after Hurricane Andrew. We saw the plaque outside on the gazebo. Hurricane Andrew was in 1992. This story happened in 2017, 2016. I'm thinking, why are they here on a hot summer afternoon? They drove all the way from north of Palm Beach. So they were Floridians, but they came a long way. In the middle of the summer, no boat trips because they were too late in the day. They came all this way. And so we're continuing to talk and have a great time. And I'm still so curious. What brought you here today? And the whole mood of our conversation changed at that point. I could see the quiver on her lips. I could hear the quaver in her voice. And she told me that her son had died recently. And I realized in that moment that Biscayne National Park was not what they were here to connect with at all. They were here to connect with their son. What do you say to someone in that situation? We continued to talk. They told me all about Jim. And I asked if I could have the article to make a photocopy of, because I genuinely wanted to read it. I felt like I knew him a little bit at this point. So she assented, and I took it into the back office, and thankfully our copier is ridiculously slow at warming up. I had some time to think and compose myself a little bit. I made the copies. I'm thinking, what am I going to say to this family who's lost so much? And what I came up with was something that has helped me in similar situations. And it's a quote by the author, Isaac Dinesen, who wrote Out of Africa. And she wrote, the cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea. When I've had situations in my life where I've needed some kind of comfort or solace, I go to the water. I go to the ocean. It's my special place. After 9/11, people came out here to be on the jetty to look at the water. Attacks in Paris, there were people out here. So many things happening in the world, people come to stare at the water. And they get that little bit of solace in a world that sometimes seems pretty crazy. You know, I've shared a lot of my stories with you, and I would venture to guess that you all have some pretty amazing stories about your experiences in national parks as well, and I hope you'll share some of those with me. But I started this little talk today describing how I got started in this when I was 7 years old, and how I traveled with my parents to some of these amazing places, including Yellowstone. Me and my dad there at Mammoth, my goofy little bowl haircut. And you know, really, as I visit these national parks, sometimes I get pretty emotional as I go to them, because this is what I remember as a kid. And I'm reminded of the words of Ken Burns, who was a documentary filmmaker. Many of you probably know he did the Civil War and baseball and jazz and all those things, but he also did one about the national parks, a 6-part documentary, 12 hours of documentary. And I was fortunate enough to work with his crew when they came and did Biscayne here. So I got invited to the premiere of some parts of the film in Miami, as he made a tour around the country on the campus of the University of Miami. And after they showed the excerpts, he took questions from the audience, and someone raised their hand and said, Mr. Burns, what's your favorite national park? And this hush falls over the crowd. Ken Burns is about to make a pronouncement. And everyone's like, what's he gonna say? Is he gonna go for the obvious? Is he gonna go for something really obscure? What's he gonna say? He answered it in the best possible way. He said, sometimes it's less about where you are than who's holding your hand when you're there. And I hope that as you travel in your couples and families to these amazing places, you recognize how much more special they are because you're with someone that you love. My very best friend in the whole world has 200 some national parks in his count, and we're gonna see all 423 together. We're gonna finish it up together at some point once we catch up with our differences on the scale there. And it's our goal, and I'm getting ready to retire, and I'm gonna do this thing. Get out there and see these amazing places. Those little tabs that you put on the map earlier, if you looked at them, it said "Find Your Park," which was our 2016 centennial catchphrase. Find your park. And no matter what you're interested in, there is a national park out there that fits that bill. And I bet that once you realize that and catch those amazing places, you're gonna find that one leads to another, to another, to another. And maybe you'll become this crazy national park fanatic kind of person too. So thank you for spending time here with me this afternoon. If you have stories you'd like to share with me, I love to hear stories from folks about your journey in the national parks. Maybe you expand your vision of what a national park is. Talking to you.
Okay.
All right. Enjoy Biscayne National Park. Thank you for joining us.